When I'm making the buttonholes at home and I don't have the machine to overcast and cut them, I'll use a small 3mm wide hole punch and a hammer. You can get these at leather supply shops or at hardware stores. And then once I've punched the eyelet, I'll take a wood chisel in the size of the buttonhole I want and place it carefully and then punch the buttonhole that way. You can use a scissor if it's very sharp, but sometimes the edge is not perfectly straight, so I much prefer a chisel, and I punch it on a wooden block. The next step is to wax your thread, and this is a really important step in it. So you would take about a full arm's length of thread, not the end as it comes off, the end of the thread closest to the spool, and then pull the thread a few times through the wax. The next thing you're going to do is put the thread between two pieces of paper and press them with a hot iron. This is going to set the wax into the thread itself. And now for the mechanics of the stitch itself. You're going to bring the needle up and out 2mm away from the cut edge of the buttonhole. And here's the part that sometimes takes a bit of getting used to. The thread that's coming out from the eye of the needle, you're going to wrap underneath the tip of the needle and around. And so when you pull the needle through, that's what's going to create the purl or the knot of the buttonhole. So study this image for a little bit, and you're going to have to practice it a few times. Okay, so you've punched your buttonhole, you've overcast it, you've waxed your thread. Now we cut a piece of gimp for the buttonhole, about 3 times the length of the buttonhole. You're going to take your needle and knot the end of the thread and insert it about 1 centimeter away from the end of the buttonhole. And by leaving this tail of thread between the layers, this prevents it from becoming undone. You would want to do the same thing when you're sewing buttons and things like that. So come into the base of the buttonhole, and I apologize, I keep pulling it out of view. Take a very small stitch and then insert the needle into the loop and pull that tight. This is just a little knot to, again, secure the end of it to make sure that it doesn't unravel. And then you take the first buttonhole stitch proper. So you insert the needle, and again, I apologize, into the buttonhole, bring it out 2mm to the left of it, wrap the thread underneath the needle and around the top, and that's what creates the purl, and pull the thread, and don't quite pull it tight because you're going to insert the gimp here. If I can pick it up. There we go. Okay, so insert the gimp into that first loop, and then pull the loop tight. So our stitches are about 2mm wide. The gimp is about 1 millimeter. So hold it 1 millimeter away from the cut edge and use it as a guide for bringing your needle up and through. And that's what's going to be your straight line. Then again, wrap the thread underneath. Oops, I've got both of them. Okay, so the thread coming out of the back of the needle goes underneath and up, and that creates a stitch. So when you pull it, you don't want to pull the knot tightly. You don't want a very tight buttonhole. The wax will help the knots to sit. And stylistically, there's a choice here about where you actually place the knot or the purl. If you pull the thread off to your right, the purl is going to sit next to the gimp, and the gimp will fill in sort of the leg, the stitch of the buttonhole. If you want a more prominent looking buttonhole, you can pull the thread straight up and the purl will sit on top of the gimp and make a much more bulky or 3D looking buttonhole. But they're very prominent. So the choice is yours. I don't like taking a very wide stitch. It just makes, well, we call them squash beetles. I try to keep my stitch as narrow as I can depending on how much the fabric's going to ravel. And then the other thing you want to think about is the size of the thread that you use, because you can easily overpower the fabric if the thread is too heavy. We used to commonly use a size 10 thread for our buttonholes, but that was really when fabrics were heavier than they are today. And so because they're lighter, I'll use a size 40 thread. Sometimes I'll use a different width or weight depending on the weight of the fabric, or because I just can't get the size I want and the color I want. But the important thing is just to have it balanced to the cloth. So you'll notice as I'm working around, I use my left hand to guide the gimp. and I work underneath, and really also notice the angle I'm coming in at. If you go straight through horizontally, as you might be inclined to do, the needle tends to come too far away from the previous stitch. And then I'm just adjusting. I hadn't wrapped quite right, so I'm just putting it back in place, and then inserting the needle coming from up and going on an angle towards the previous stitch. So you get really close, and just occasionally, yeah, moving the stitches back into place when they don't sit quite right. And when you're practicing, I recommend using contrast thread, because you really see where your stitches are maybe uneven. You see where you need to improve a little bit. They say you have to make 100 buttonholes by hand before you're any good at it. I don't know if that's entirely true. I don't remember how many I made. I certainly made a lot when I was practicing. Just go under the gimp, wrap it, pull the thread. Oh, I got a knot. Even with wax, sometimes it knots. Another thing, you want to be careful about the amount of wax you use with lighter colors, because when you press it, it can stain the garment. And the wax will make the thread go a shade darker. So if you're doing lighter colors, you may want to choose a thread that's just a tiny bit lighter in color than what you want as it's finished. And it thinned out, wax a piece of thread, press it, and you'll see the final color of it. And if you're working with really light fabrics, you may have to skip the wax, but I find the wax really, really helps to set the knots so you don't have to pull them tight. If you use a really soft silk thread, sometimes it can be quite difficult to get even knots without the wax. So here, as you come around the loop, you're going to have to fan the stitches, and this takes a little bit of practice to get a sense of how to fan them out and how to do them evenly. You also want a stitch that's a little bit wider than the one you used on the legs of the buttonhole. And the reason is that, whereas I was saying I placed the loop kind of, or the knot kind of next to the gimp on the legs of the buttonhole, when I come around the eyelet, I'm going to pull the thread straight up and sit the knot right on top of the gimp, which has the result of not crowding the eyelet and giving enough room for the shank of the button. And you see with my index finger, I'm just sort of gently pushing the gimp around to form that loop. I really love this kind of gimp. It makes especially that eyelet so much easier to get a nice, because it's got some springiness to the gimp. When you're just using regular stranded gimp or none at all, sometimes that eyelet can be challenging to get nice and even. My usual source of gimp has discontinued production. I'm very upset. I know there are other sources around. I don't know who they are or where they are. Certainly tailor supply shops, if you're buying sort of at a retail level, a lot of them still have the same stuff I used to buy, because they had, they had bulk quantities they had bought. So it's still possible to get this particular gimp, but I know there are other suppliers of it. There's other makers of it. When I find a specific one, I'll let people know. But if you're out hunting, because there's a style of buttonhole that absolutely requires this kind of gimp to make it, and that buttonhole is almost exclusively, or was almost exclusively, made in Rome and in Paris, you may want to try tailor supply stores in those areas, because they're more likely to have it. In fact, that style of buttonhole, the azola lucida, you may have seen, if you've looked at Tom Ford garments. In fact, he started putting them on his garments, and that's when I think people started really noticing them. And then all of a sudden, you see them in a lot of garments. It looks more like sort of, well, I mean, it just looks like a piece of gimp in 2 rows without any knots, and you wrap it with silk thread, so it's quite shiny. Thus, lucida, which is Italian for shiny. They call it a shiny buttonhole. It looks very smooth. There's no knots. It takes a long time to make those things, and you have to be really, really neat and very good at doing them. I first saw one of those in Paris years ago, and didn't know anything about it, certainly didn't know how to make it. And then I started hearing people referring to it as a Milanese buttonhole, which confused me because I'd been to Milan a lot and I'd never seen one in Milan. In fact, first I saw them in Paris and then I'd see them in Rome. Or, I mean, Brioni used to put them, or they still put them on their tuxedos. Incidentally, at Hickey Freeman, we do that buttonhole on our full dress tailcoats. We still have a few people who know how to do them. So anyway, I was curious about this buttonhole that they said they called the Milanese buttonhole, and years ago I found a package of gimp, and the brand name was La Milanesa. So like Kleenex or zippers or a lot of products that eventually become referred to by a brand name, I think, and this is me speculating, in Paris they would refer to gimp as Milanese, and this is a boutonnière à la Milanaise, or a buttonhole with gimp, and therefore people started referring to them as a Milanese buttonhole. But as I looked at the tailors who were doing them and the areas where you would see them, it occurred to me that Domenico Caraceni was one of the most prominent tailors of the early 1900s, and he evolved a style of his own and even published a book, a treatise, I think he called it. And it's very likely, in my opinion, that this style of buttonhole was part of some of his new ideas about tailoring. A lot of the top tailors in Paris, Camps de Luca, Cifonelli, trace their lineage back to the Abruzzo region in Italy. And I think, was it Augusto Caraceni, one of the brothers, had gone to Paris and set up a tailor shop. So whether the French tailors all learned this in Italy and then moved to Paris, or they learned it in Paris from Caraceni, I think it's very reasonable to assume that that's the lineage. If you look at all the top bespoke tailors in Paris, they all do that buttonhole, but they also have a very distinct style, especially how they finish the lining inside. And there's certain fancy pockets and things that most of them do. So it's quite obvious a lot of them trace their technique to a particular school or workshop or tailor, and probably goes back to the workshop of Augusto Caraceni. So I'm coming to the end of the buttonhole, and then I'm going to just clip away the excess gimp, and then take 3 stitches. I'm making a bar tack of sorts. So you go across the entire width of the base of the buttonhole, come across, take 3 stitches. Some people will wrap these 3 stitches in a buttonhole stitch. I find that's too bulky. I'll either just wrap it by going around, or I make a blanket stitch, which is similar to a buttonhole stitch, but doesn't have as thick of a purl. And I also use the eye of the needle, because if you use the point of the needle, you can pierce the thread, and that's not very pretty. So you'll notice I come through, and in this case, I don't catch the loop. So I'm just wrapping. I'm not making that blanket stitch. And so once I've wrapped that bar tack a few times, then I'll insert the needle back through, go through the base, come out the back, and you'll notice the back is never very pretty, and then go into the thread, into the buttonhole itself, and come out, say, 1 centimeter away. And this is, again, just to leave a long tail of thread so that the buttonhole doesn't unravel. Then I clip away the length of thread, and hopefully I have enough left, so I'll knot that piece of thread. And I'm going to baste the buttonhole shut for pressing. So you'll also notice that your buttonhole, because of the wax, the thread is not as shiny as it was on the reel. After you press it, you'll set the wax some more, and you'll get some of that shininess back. So I just come in near the bottom of the buttonhole and do a basic whip stitch or overcast stitch to hold the buttonhole closed until I'm done pressing, and then I'll take those basting stitches out and just squeeze the gimp together with your thumbnails to hold it nice and tight. at Hickey Freeman, because the back of the buttonhole is never pretty like this, we would actually go and rework the buttonhole from the other side. So we do it on both sides. When you're doing the back, you don't go all the way around so that your stitch is visible. You'd sort of come into the cut edge of the buttonhole, so that both sides look nice and finished. I know Oxford Clothes in Chicago does that. I haven't seen many tailors that do it because it takes twice the amount of time for the finisher, but it does look a little nicer. So there you have an extreme close-up of my buttonhole with just the contrast punched a little bit so you can see it a little better.